In today's note, we're going to be looking at another specific type of factoring. This is going to be factoring x squared plus bx plus c. So this is going to be factoring a trinomial or an expression that has three terms. This is going to be similar to the difference of squares, where we're looking for a pattern within the trinomial and using that to help us fill in our factors. So basically, to factor an expression of the form x squared plus bx plus c, we need to find a pair of integers, or basically find two numbers, m and n, that have a sum of b. So basically they add to b. So two numbers that add to b, and the same two numbers with a product, or that they multiply to c. So basically we're finding two numbers, when you add them, they add to b, or your middle number, and when they multiply, they work out to c, or your last number. And when we find these two numbers, basically x squared plus bx plus c works out to x plus m and multiplied by x plus n. So basically, once you find those two numbers, you plug them in to your equation. So basically, it'd be x plus that one integer times x plus n, or your other integer. And we'll work through some examples, and we'll go through a couple different ways. But basically, the hardest part is going to be finding those two numbers. It's more of like a puzzle almost. So in the first example, we want to factor this trinomial. So we have x squared plus bx plus c, basically. So we have our b value here, we have our c value here. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to find two numbers that give us a sum, or s. So two numbers that have to add together to equal b or 7. So two numbers that add to 7, and p, or a product, is the same two numbers have to multiply to equal 12. Another way you could do this, another way I've done it before, is you could consider this something called an X puzzle. So the way the X puzzle works is just another way of organizing your information, just to help you. The way it works, the b value, the middle, goes to the bottom. The c value goes to the top. And again, it's just another way of organizing. Top multiply, the bottom two numbers have to add to that, and you're filling them in. So basically 12 goes on the top, 7 goes on the bottom, and we're trying to find two numbers that fill in the two sides, so that when you add them together, they add to 7 and then they multiply to 12. So just a different way to organize your thinking. So if you're having trouble finding what the two numbers are, I always recommend you want to start with the product or the multiplying first. Because it's easier to find two numbers that multiply to a specific number than finding two numbers that add to a specific number, because the list is going to be a lot smaller. So if we look at these two numbers, or if we look at 12, what numbers multiply to 12? Well, we have 1 times 12, we have 2 times 6, we have 3 times 4, and that is about it. Then we start repeating our numbers. So basically, we have to find something in between these numbers. So 1 times 2 does work out to 12, but 1 plus 2, or 12, does not equal 7. 2 times 6 is 12, but 2 plus 6 is not 7. So that leaves us with the last one. So let's just check. 3 times 4 does equal 12, and 3 plus 4 does equal 7. So that is the answer to our puzzle. Those are the two numbers that we're looking for. Those are our m and our n value. So once we find those, Then we go back, and now when we factor, it becomes x. X is going to be our first term, and then we're just going to plug our two numbers in. So plus 3 and plus 4. So those are the two numbers. So x squared plus 7x plus 12 factors down to x plus 3 times x plus 4. So that is our factored form. Let's try the same thing, but for this next one. So we know we're going to have two brackets. We know x is going to be first. Now we just need to find our two numbers. Right? We are going to be looking for our b, and we're going to be looking for our c value here. So regardless of how you want to do it, if you want to do an x puzzle, that's fine. So c goes on top where we multiply. So we have 6. B goes on the bottom. Now here we want to be careful. We want to include that negative. So it's negative 5. Or you could do the product and sum, which is the same thing. So sum equals two numbers that add to negative 5. Product, two numbers that multiply to 6. Again, start with the numbers that multiply to 6. So the one thing we want to watch out for here, because they have to add to a negative, but they're multiplying to a positive, there's a good chance that your two numbers are going to be both negative. Because again, the only way you can get a positive number when multiplying is by having two negatives or two positives, but the only way to get a negative number by adding out of those two scenarios would have to be adding two negative numbers. So let's just go through first and just focus on getting to multiply to 6. So we have 1 times 6, and we have 2 times 3, and that's it. So 2 times 3 works to get to 6. 2 plus 3 works to get to positive 5. But again, remember, we talked about the other option is we have the negative of both. So negative 1 times negative 6, negative 2 times negative 3. Those also work. And because we're looking at, we want negative 5, not positive 5, let's just switch the signs on those negative, on that 2 and the 3. So our numbers are actually going to be negative 2 and negative 3. Because if I add negative 2 and negative 3, I get negative 5. And if I multiply those together, I get 6. So those are going to be my two numbers. Since those are my two numbers, I'm going to plug them in right after the x, keeping the signs. So that means that my factored form now becomes x minus 2 times x minus 3. And again, c, we're going to do the same thing. We know we're going to have two sets of brackets. We know we're going to have an x first. We just need to figure out what our two numbers are. So again, regardless of how you do it, whether you have your c value or minus 15, you have your b value or negative 2 for the x puzzle, or you use the product and sum. So s is equal to two numbers that when you add them equal a number, and the product, two numbers when you multiply equal a specific number. In this case, they multiply to negative 15, and they have to add to negative 2, or that middle number. So here, because we have a negative at the end, what we want to, basically our numbers, when we're multiplying, one has to be positive and one has to be negative. So that's going to help us a little bit. So let's start just going through the factors of 15 or negative 15. So we have 1 times 15, 2 doesn't work, we have 3 times 5, and that is it. So again, we can't use positives to both positives, so let's play around with this. If I used negative 3 times positive 5, that would give me negative 15 when I multiply, but when I add, that would give me positive 2. In that case, then, I just need to switch these around. So I need to make it positive 3 times negative 5, so that when they multiply, that does work. And when I add those together, I get negative 2. So basically, if you're if you're multiplying to a negative number and you have to add to a negative number, you're going to have a positive and a negative number, and the larger number should be negative. If it's the other way around where they had to add to a positive, your positive number would be the larger one. So in this case, our two answers for the puzzle are 3 and -5. I'm just going to plug those into the equation. So x plus 3, x minus 5. It would help to have a multiplication table on hand, whether you print one off or you make one or you have one on your phone when doing these types of problems, because it will help find what those two numbers are if you're not confident with your own multiplication tables. So example 2, the area of a locker is x² plus x minus 30. We need to determine the expressions in x, or in terms of x, for the length and the width of the locker. So same type of question we've been doing in the past. We want to find our length and our width. So basically I need to break down the area, that is x² plus x minus 30, into basically two terms multiplied by each other. We know x is going to be first, as is the pattern, and we can go from there. We know that the c value is going to be the last one, the b value is going to be in the middle. So whether we use our x pattern or we use our product and sum, where we have two numbers that add to equal, two numbers that multiply to equal, whether it's -30 or whether it's, well, in this case, what is our b value? If we don't see a number in front, remember there's that invisible 1, so our b value is actually 1, or +1. So let me just write out in the puzzle. Again, you don't have to do both, whichever one you feel comfortable with. So because we're multiplying to a negative number, that means that we should have a positive and a negative. So if we go through for 30, we have 1 times 30, 2 times 15, 3 times 10, nothing with 4, 5 times 6, and that's it. So if one of these numbers is negative, 1 and 30, there's no way to get to 1. 2 and 15, still no way to get to 1. 3 and 10, there's still no way, because it needs to have a difference of 1. So that leaves us with 5 times 6. But 5 times 6 gives us +30. We want -30. So again, similar to the last example we just did on the last page, we talked about if I'm looking to multiply it to a negative number and they have to add to a positive, that means that one has to be negative, one has to be positive, but the larger one needs to be positive. So in this case, it would be 6 times -5 and 6 plus -5, which gives us 1. So that does work. So we have 6 and -5. Take those two answers, plug them back into our brackets. So +6 minus 5. And now we want to determine the length and the width of the locker. So again, it doesn't really matter which one is which. We say x is length is x plus 6, width is equal to x minus 5. And now we're just plugging in x equals 30. So length equals 30 plus 6. Length equals 36. Width equals 30 minus 5, so width equals 25, and the units is centimeters. So basically we're just plugging in x into each bracket. So that's pretty much it for difference of squares. I'm just going to write down the little tips or the hints to figure out what our two numbers are. So if the product is positive and the sum is positive, then m and n are both positive. If we have the sum is equal to a negative and the product is equal to a negative, m and n, we have one positive, or we have the larger number is negative, and the smaller number is positive. And lastly, for our product and sum, if the sum is equal to a positive number and the product is equal to a negative number, then m and n, the larger number is positive, the smaller number is negative. So that's just something to help you figure out what your m and your n values are. You're not going to have a situation where the product is positive and, oh no, you could have that. Sorry. So if the sum is negative and the product is positive, m and n, both numbers are negative. So those are the four different situations that you could come across. Again, remember the product and sum. I'll write that down as well. S equals sum, or m plus n. P equals product, or m times n. So those are the kind of the patterns that we're looking for. We're looking for two numbers that again add to a number, and the same two numbers have to multiply to another number. These are kind of the hints to look for, or the patterns to look for when trying to figure out the signs on your numbers.